Hey guys, since I am not able to be at school today, I wanted to go over this information with you on the French Revolution, which you started yesterday. You did the SQ3R note taking strategy, so hopefully you've got a little bit of an understanding of what the French Revolution was. But I've got a reading passage for you today. I'm going to read through it and I'm going to mark some things on my paper that I want you to mark on your paper as well. And then I'm going to let you guys work on the questions on the back. So this is already broken up into 4 sections for us. So we'll start with the first one, which is political causes. We've got the title is Prelude to the Revolution. And remember, pre means before. So this is talking about events in France that led up to this revolution. So we're going to start with political causes. It says the French government had been in absolute monarchy mode for several hundred years. By definition, the king shared his power with no one. So the word monarchy stands out to me. Do you all know what a monarchy is? A monarchy is a country ruled by a king or a queen. So I'm just going to kind of make a note up to the top. A country ruled by a king or queen. And it says here, the king shared his power with no one. Okay, so he had absolute power. So it said absolute up here. Okay, the second bullet says the French Parliament had not met in over 175 years, and French people had very few legal or political rights. There was no freedom of speech or press, and very little freedom of religion. People who openly criticized the government were jailed, and sometimes never even had a trial. Okay. We got the word parliament up here. This is kind of like the government, basically. Might be a good way to understand that word. The French government, the people who helped run the country, the leaders, the political leaders, had not met in over 175 years. Y'all, that's like a really long time. People lived their entire lifetimes and had never seen any changes in the way things were run in the country. No political rights, no freedom of speech or press, very little freedom of religion. Okay. And in the third bullet, it says, additionally, there was little judicial due process in France at this time, which means people who were accused were considered guilty until they could prove their innocence. So like in today's culture in our country, the phrase is you're considered innocent until proven guilty. Well, that was not the case back then. You were considered guilty until proven innocent. So that's not a good thing. Come over here to social causes and let's look at this one. The first bullet says there had always been vast gaps between the upper and lower classes in French society. What had changed by the 1700s in France was the rise of a wealthy and educated middle class, the bourgeoisie. This is an important word that you need to know. Have you guys heard the phrase, if someone's really bougie or bougie? I don't even know how y'all say that. That's kind of a reference to this word. Like, you're kind of wealthy, upper class, fancy kind of thing. So the bourgeoisie were townspeople. France had become increasingly urban in the 17th and 18th centuries, and as a result, a healthy and wealthy middle class of lawyers, bankers, educators, merchants, and doctors had begun to crop up. In many cases, the middle classes were wealthier than the nobility. And though the nobility needed the middle classes, they did not respect them. They refused to intermarry, and they considered them dirty tradesmen who had to work for a living. So the nobility here, I don't know if that's a word you're familiar with. Nobility would be the people like royalty, people who are related to the king or the queen, or very, very high status in society. So the bourgeoisie were growing restless, and they were unhappy at their lack of social mobility. Despite their wealth, they were unable to make their way into the upper classes. Okay? So we've got political issues going on here. We've got social problems happening. And then let's look at the economic causes down here. The economic situation in France was the driving force behind revolution. Do y'all remember what a revolution is? You should. It was one of our test questions on our last unit. A revolution is really just like a big change. So France is going through a big change right now. The gaps between the rich and the poor had widened, and as the common people struggled to feed their families, desperation increased and the mood grew revolutionary. In France, only 3% of the population, the nobles and the church, own nearly 50% of the land. By 1789, the French treasury was bankrupt due to foreign wars, aid that had been sent to the Americans in their revolution, and extravagant living at Versailles. Nearly a quarter of the taxes collected annually went to the maintenance of the king's lifestyle at Versailles, and the upper classes, the nobles and the church in France, paid no taxes. So I'm going to underline that. The upper classes paid no taxes. So that basically means the richest people didn't have to pay, and the people who didn't have as much money did, which doesn't make any sense to me. I'm also going to circle Versailles. That was as a city in France where the king lived. I know it looks like Versailles, but you say that Versailles because in French you have silent letters, and it's not as complicated as English, but sometimes it's complicated. So Versailles is how you say that. And our last bullet says the final straw was the famine of 1788 and 89. Bread was scarce and terribly expensive, and the people of France were starving. So there was no money. The rich people didn't pay taxes, the poor people did. And then there was a huge famine on top of that, and people were starving. So as you can imagine, people were ready to see a change. And in our last box over here is intellectual causes. The writings of the Enlightenment philosophers served to stir things up in 18th century France. Many of the philosophers were French. We had this guy named Montesquieu, another one named Voltaire, and then Rousseau. And their writings contained direct criticisms of the French government. So there were these people who were not afraid to speak out against the government. The educated bourgeoisie latched on to the philosophies and began to question what type of a social contract existed in France. They wondered why they did not have individual rights, personal freedoms, and a say in the government. So once these ideas or these questions were introduced to the rest of French society, it made people really start looking for answers and putting pressure on the leaders of the country to make things change. So, all right, so we've got some notes there. Hopefully that'll help you when you answer the questions on the back. There's 13 of these, so there's kind of a lot. Most of it you can find directly in the text. You'll just have to go back and skim through the information here. So, you guys work on that, and I'll hopefully see everybody back tomorrow.